Kristina Jackets, and I work as an English teacher at Tiffin Girls, and I also train trainee teachers at the University of Roehampton. And I'm going to talk today about Oracy, and with a particular kind of slant towards the students that find it more challenging to contribute in the classroom. And I imagine if I was making this interactive, you might have guessed why I've got the people that I've got on my screen. So the real question is, what have Eleanor Roosevelt, Barack Obama, Rosa Parks, Gandhi, Emma Watson, and Meryl Streep got in common? And the answer is that they're all self-proclaimed introverts, but you'll know as well as I do that that doesn't hold them back from being amazing leaders and speakers when prepared. So we're going to think about how we can make everyone in our classroom confident speakers. So I was thinking what had motivated me to look at this topic particularly, and I think there are three things, and one of them dates all the way back to 2008-9 for any teachers kind of old enough like me to remember the social and emotional aspects of learning curriculum, which was part of the pastoral programme. And I remember these materials, and I've given you a little sample here, although lots of them seem to have been removed from the web now. But I really remember partly this picture and this kind of prose. So this was a group, and it was meant for year 7, and we heard about all the different people in this group, but we also heard about Oscar here. And Oscar is described as sitting reading with his feet on the chair, oblivious to all that was going on around him, as opposed to Ellie, who's chatting, telling jokes, and generally the life of the party. And the SEAL materials went on to talk about Steve becoming increasingly quiet. And generally speaking, the message seemed to be that Oscar needed to put his book down and join the rest of the group. Similarly, some of the other SEAL materials had questionnaires. And if I just show you this one and draw your attention to question 3, this was for year 7 as well, and they were asked things like, how to be happier than average, and the correct answer was having lots of good friends and getting on well with your family. And I started to think there was a bit of a kind of similarity in some of these materials that felt like they were pathologizing some elements of introversion rather than just talking about having the ability to speak confidently in different settings. The other thing that drew me to this topic is that I'm an introvert, and I remember with horror the feeling of cold calling in the classroom and not having had time to think of what I was going to say. The final thing that drew me down this route was I've got a colleague that I now work with at Roehampton University who used to teach at Tiffin Girls, and she looked at some of our Korean students and their culture. The students have been identified as making less frequent contributions in classroom discussion. And she started to look at things like the concept of nunchi, which carries with it ideas about deference in group discussion, not overlapping, not interrupting one another, and that some of these things culturally can be seen as more rude and more kind of disrespectful than in other cultures. So I began to think with the cultural aspect as well. Then I got obsessed with my current year 9 class. So this year, my project for my CPD is around Oracy. And this year 9 class are wonderful, but a lot of them are really reluctant to make contributions in open discussion in English. So I embarked on a project to make us all better speakers, and that included me. So we've been doing a lot of videoing ourselves having classroom discussion. I've been videoing myself when I contribute in any form of discussion, and we've been helping one another to improve. So I started by talking to them about the importance of having Oracy skills and how much importance that can hold in later life. I also introduced them to David Robson's book, The Expectation Effect, and the idea that they need to have the expectation that they can become and be confident speakers and how much difference that can make to them. I shared with them some of Linda Lee Bosel's rules for assertive communication, and it was originally called Rules for Communication for Women, but I took that away because I think they apply to everyone. And partly I shared this with them because lots of my students were speaking, but in a really self-effacing way. So they'd make a contribution, but they'd apologise for what they were about to say before they said it. Or they'd start their contribution with something like, I'm sure this is not going to be right, but, but lots of what they were saying was, of course, brilliant. So I started by just raising their consciousness around these being habits that less confident speakers have, but we can train ourselves not to do these things. And some of these habits can impact the power of our message. So there's a kind of social justice dimension to it as well, which they were taken by. As part of my project, I got them to nominate coaches within the class who they'd be open to receiving feedback from. So they all listed 1 to 3 people who weren't necessarily their friends, but would provide really realistic, honest feedback. And I nominated my own coaches too. So my coaches, when they see a bit of me speaking or I do a speech in front of them, they give me sometimes brutal feedback on every aspect of it. We also began to talk about introversion and extroversion because it's not something we particularly talk about in the classroom. And Susan Cain, who wrote a brilliant book about quiet leadership, talks about the fact we should help students to understand whether they are more introverted or more extroverted, because without talking about it, they can start to think in an extrovert-driven culture that there's something wrong. And actually, we've been talking about the fact that listening and thinking are really good things. And the 10% of the time that an introvert might make a contribution, it's likely to be a really thoughtful contribution. So extroverts and introverts can learn from one another in the classroom. I became really introverted in preferences, particularly the crucial detail that an extrovert in general terms will learn and think through talk, and an introvert will think and then talk. And I've certainly always noticed that myself as a difference between me and my husband, me and people I work with. I think and then I want to talk. And I began to think about how much our classrooms are built for introverts or extroverts in how we hold classroom discussions. So this is my very complex looking spreadsheet. I've been keeping track of my class. So I started, and I've anonymized this, but I started through rating them and grouping them into kind of 3 mini sets on most confident to least confident speakers. And that was just through my perception of them by February of this year. Then I got them to take an online test of their extroversion score in the second column. And there was a correlation between my perception of them as a confident speaker and their self-perception as an extrovert in general terms. There were 1 or 2 outliers, but in general terms. They also nominated their coaches, and then we've been tracking participation and, crucially, how good they are at listening as well as speaking. So in terms of what we can all try in the classroom and me developing my own project, these 2 books are game changers. So Quiet by Susan Cain and A Quiet Education, which is about challenging the extrovert ideal in our schools. Susan Cain talks about how can we create a temperament inclusive classroom? Are we giving time for people to think before we expect them to speak? Are we giving enough silent time in our classroom before paired discussion even? She talks about the silence talk continuum and suggests that a lot of the time we've got the balance too far in the direction of talk apart from when we assess silently. She also gives some rubric for how we might begin to offer everyone a way into classroom discussion, to give more value to extending other people's points of view and asking questions, and to challenge students who interrupt and overlap could be a way of integrating introverts and extroverts. So here are a few strategies that I've tried and that seem to be working for me. So brainwriting before brainstorming, not having a group discussion until everyone has filled in their own brainstorm of silent writing, their ideas first. Having some different group norms. So talking about the fact that some people are less comfortable with interruption and how can we manage that. I found something that was true for me and my more introverted students was in a free discussion, they found it really hard to enter the conversation without some signal. Now, I know that even in a group of adults, I'm likely to put my hand up to speak. And it looks ridiculous, but that's because I find it hard to come in to an open discussion. So we've started some non-verbal signals for people to signal they'd like to enter the conversation. Having more silence. Pre-releasing questions so that my introverts can have time to think and note take. counting to 10 more often in discussion to give a little pause for everyone to gather their thoughts before they have to speak again. Susan Cain suggests a midway reflection point in any discussion lesson where everyone is allowed to free write for a couple of minutes just to be able to reflect on what's been said and what they could say next. This is one of my big bugbears with trainee teachers. If you use Think, Pair, Share in your classroom, I bet the chances are that actually what you do is pair share. The time that I see pair share happening is a lot more than the time that I see given to a moment of quiet or silent reflection before the paired discussion happens. And unless we get that right, we're doing the introverts an injustice and we're lessening the quality of the Think, Pair, Share format. Being sensitive to non-verbal cues, some of your quiet students are going to glance upwards when they want to speak and then glance down again, and we need to read their non-verbal cues. Valuing listening. How much in a classroom discussion are you praising students that maybe only say one thing but show that they've taken on board others' viewpoints? How much are we challenging those who talk for just talk's sake? Encouraging people to be quiet, not silent. So saying one thing, making one question contribution. Talking explicitly to people that find making contributions difficult about striking early and how they will enter the conversation. Go with your best point, get it in early. Can the teacher come to the more introverted students first in classroom discussion to ensure their points don't get taken? And strategies to avoid being interrupted. I thought this was so interesting. Susan Cain talks about training students to hold up a hand, like a kind of stop gesture, to stop an interruption from happening, because often someone will just stop speaking if interrupted, whereas someone more confident will carry on speaking. How do we help students to manage conversational interruption? And if there's only one thing you remember from all of this, it would be the crucial detail of introverts thinking through silent preparation time and then talking, and extroverts thinking through talk, and managing a classroom that does both.